All right. Hi, guys. My name is Tina, and thank you for joining me tonight. And I'm going to be talking about Chapter 12, Toward Behavior Analytic Practice and Augmentative and Alternate Communication. Whew, that's a mouthful, so we're just going to say AAC. So here's your objectives and task list. After this presentation, you should be able to define AAC, define FCT, which is Functional Communication Training, some strategies for teaching functional communication and the forms of MANS, recognize a generalization gradient. Sorry. And I've listed some things from the BACB task list, 5th edition, that I thought would apply, and were quite a few that I thought actually applied. So, as we already know, communication is challenging for a lot of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including those with autism. It is even a bigger problem for those whose spoken language is not possible. It is pertinent in the world of behavior analysis for us to provide access to and support for effective, evidence-based communication intervention. There have been lots of studies evaluating the use of speech-generating devices, as well as the outcomes of their use. The studies have shown, yes, the SGDs, the speech generating devices work, but there appears to be a high rate of failure and abandonment. This doesn't appear to be an issue with the learners or their caregivers, but more so a failure of the clinicians and educators selecting ACC strategies that are the most efficient for that particular learner, and their environment seems to be the downfall. Turns out most studies just used a train and hope strategy when it came to generalization and maintenance. And this is where this chapter comes into play, to help us understand AAC and examine how ABA principles and procedures can be used to improve the long-term success and use of AAC interventions. The American Speech Language Hearing Association defines AAC as all strategies, devices, or forms that are used to replace or supplement speech when communicating thoughts, needs, or ideas. This includes unaided forms of communication like gestures, facial expressions, body movement, sign language, along with aided communication like high-tech speech-generated devices, as well as low-tech applications like PECs. If you think about it, we all use some unaided communication like head nods, tensed bodies. It's just our clients with little to no communication benefit from access to a lot more than these unaided forms of communication. Let's see, the type of AAC will depend on the individual and their needs. We want to ensure we are choosing the best form of communication for them, such that their communication is meaningful to those around them, and so that we are maximizing their efficiency at communicating. FCT, Functional Communication Training, was originally developed to reduce problem behaviors like aggression, property destruction, self-injury, tantrums. Its goal was to teach a functionally equivalent and socially acceptable alternative to communicate to gain or keep access to reinforcers that maintain the initial problem behavior. 30-plus years of research supports the effectiveness of FCT as an intervention for severe problem behaviors in a large range of populations, not just autism. This chapter goes on to tell us that FCT is one of the most viable applications of ABA for communication interventions. FCT has been shown to not just reduce problem behavior, but also increase appropriate communication in general, as well as to increase socially acceptable alternative behaviors, which suggests that FCT could be used as a communication intervention strategy, even in the absence of problem behaviors. Recently, it was shown to increase manding or requesting for individuals that did not engage in severe problem behaviors. Before we can implement FCT, we must first successfully identify the source or sources of reinforcement that are maintaining the target behaviors. So you know what that means, right? We must conduct a functional analysis. This part is critical to the process. Why, you ask? Well, let's say we believe the function of the target behavior is escape from difficult work, and we teach them to ask for help with challenging work, but the true function is to escape the teacher's attention during the difficult task. This intervention isn't going to work and more than likely cause an increase in problem behaviors. This tells us that it is extremely important to correctly identify the function and its reinforcers. Now, once we know the function, we can teach and reinforce novel communicative behaviors. So, as we've already learned in this program here at GMU, and most likely from our jobs as well, the intervention we are implementing must be functionally equivalent, but it must also be response efficient. We learned last week that the matching theory tells us if there are more than one functionally equivalent responses, we must distribute the most responses to the alternative that is the most efficient. There are 4 components that affect response efficiency: response effort, rate of reinforcement, quality of reinforcement, and immediacy of reinforcement. We might be able to bias an individual's responding towards or away from a behavior by alternating one or more of these components. What exactly does that mean, you ask? Well, the example the book used is, let's say we want a learner to use a speech-generating device to ask for a break rather than tearing up their worksheet when it's given to them. The speech-generating device must be more efficient in terms of physical effort and parameters of reinforcement than tearing up the worksheet. Most times, in the eye of the learner, though, tearing up the worksheet takes less effort than getting the device, searching for, and then selecting break on the device. Keep in mind as well that tearing up the worksheet is likely to result in immediate reinforcement, especially if there isn't another copy of the worksheet to give the learner. So, to make using the speech generation device more efficient, the device needs to be very simple, especially at the beginning. It also needs to ensure that the requests result in at least, more preferably, as much reinforcement in terms of rate, immediacy, and quality. Keep in mind when teaching learners to use a communication device, whether to replace problem behavior or to just increase their communication, response efficiency is going to come into play. Students have proven that response efficiency needs to be carefully considered when figuring out which AAC device or strategy to use for beginning communication. How do we select the right communication system for our learner? We can use behavior analytic technologies to help us select an aided or an unaided system that will be the most functional and successful for our learners. We or the SLP need to carefully consider the match between the characteristics of the learner, their communication partners, and the environments in which the learner will need to communicate. Currently, and unfortunately, there aren't any clear evidence-based guidelines to base our decisions on. Because of the lack of clear guidelines, researchers have used single-subject experimental designs to compare how quickly a learner acquires new responses across different communicative modes. They've used this design to also demonstrate a clear advantage of one communication strategy or mode over another across participants. With this type of design, you can figure out what types of symbols the learner prefers. Are they text-based, iconic, bliss symbols, stick figures, gestural, color photos, product logos, line draw symbols, and the list goes on. Others have used an adapted alternative treatments design where they rapidly alternate between 2 or more assessment conditions, and they apply a different set of responses to each intervention condition rather than keeping the same dependent variable for all conditions. So we need to look at speed of acquisition of learning and at preference of the learner. Van Diermeer, Sutherland, O'Reilly, Lanciconi, and Sigafus in 2012 did find that faster acquisition and better maintenance were associated with the preferred communication mode for all the participants. However, the degree to which preference equates to more efficient learning and better generalization is not clear. There is, though, preliminary evidence that points to the purpose of the communication of training makes a difference. If the purpose is to replace problem behaviors, the preliminary evidence says the learner's preference may not be a good indicator of which form to use. Next, the book goes into discussing the teaching of conditional use of MANs. It tells us that once we have chosen an appropriate communication mode and the type of symbols to be taught, it's time to move to teaching functional use of the communication skills. If the intervention isn't to replace problem behavior, then the focus should be on introducing requesting, or as Skinner says, MANs. As MANs are usually the first in beginning communication. MAN training should be taught using dense reinforcement schedules and using preferred activities and items. Once these are mastered, we will turn to maintaining and generalization for these newly acquired communication skills. The problems that arise here are that we might no longer have a controlled environment, which means the request may not be able to be reinforced in the current setting, or the request might not be appropriate for the current setting, or we might not be able to maintain a continuous and dense schedule of reinforcement in that setting. Due to these problems, we will more than likely need to thin the reinforcement schedules either during or soon after the skill is mastered. We need to make sure the skill maintains rather than heads for extinction when no longer in the controlled setting. One way to do this is to use a delay schedule. With this type of schedule, we will introduce a progressive time delay to reinforcement. Let's say the demand is for a preferred item. In this case, we would tell the learner to wait for the reinforcer, or maybe we tell them they first must finish the task at hand and then they can have the reinforcer. Or if the learner is asking for a break, we would implement demand fading, have the learner complete more and more tasks before they're able to access a break. So unfortunately, 50% of FCT studies have shown that delay schedules alone are not sufficient to transfer stimulus control to the natural environment. This is where signaling the learner of a delay or reinforcement might help the learner to wait because they know when it's going to occur. An alternate to thinning the schedule is to use concurrent schedules to get the learner to use one response over another. The example the book uses is we've taught the learner to ask for help with difficult math problems rather than exhibiting destructive behavior. The learner then starts to ask for help even when he knows how to do the problem. So to get the learner to only ask for help when he really required help, competing concurrent schedules of reinforcement were implemented. What does this mean? We will provide a heck of a lot more reinforcement for independent problem solving than when the learner requests help. So the learner still receives help when requesting, but nothing more. However, if they solved a problem on their own, lots of reinforcement was provided. Another method to help with the generalization and the transfer of communication from the controlled environment to other environments is stimulus control procedures. This is based on Skinner's three-term contingency, which is when a behavior occurs in the presence of a certain antecedent stimulus, but not in its absence. So the antecedent stimulus, the SD, lets the learner know the reinforcement is available for, say, using the AAC, or the else delta, which lets the learner know the reinforcement is not available. So say the teacher stepped out of the room, so she's not there to reinforce. You can also use multiple schedules. This next section it takes a village of dependent measures to teach functional communication skills. Well, the example in the book uses when a learner has been taught to communicate no thanks when offered a non-preferred food item rather than exhibiting a problem behavior. And then the learner communicates no thanks when given their anti-seizure medications. As you can see, this is quite problematic. At this point, we will need to implement other interventions with mighty contingencies for taking his meds. General case instruction is the final section. It tells us that instead of teaching generalization after a learner has mastered a skill, we can be proactive and introduce it right from the beginning. Teach the learner to use new communication skills conditionally based on natural environment cues. How do we do that? We provide examples across a range of possible stimuli where they would use that communication skill along with examples where it would be inappropriate to use that skill. So we're providing positive and negative teaching examples. O'Neill and Reckel in 1993 came up with a 6-step procedure for general case instruction for beginner communicators, and I've listed those here. It can determine a range of stimuli should elicit response as well as it shouldn't, determine a response variation and stimulus variation, select positive and negative teaching examples, sequence the teaching, teach the examples, and then test for acquisition. So one way to measure how stimulus parameters affect generalization is to use a figure called generalization gradients. And here are 3 different examples showing whether a learner can generalize what they've learned. Seeing it visually like this makes it easier to determine if they have or have not. Well, and that's it for my presentation. Thank you for joining me. I've created a short quiz for those of you who didn't watch this live. Once you submit it, I will let Professor Randall know you participated. For those of you who are here with me live, you don't need to complete this quiz. I'm taking a screenshot of everyone who is present and will let our professor know. Thank you again for joining me tonight. I'm going to just quickly click this so that you can see. Here's just a quick assessment for those of you who are watching it not live. Thank you.